Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Our mission here is to take complex, high-stakes documents and geopolitical reports and give you the essential context, the surprising details, and the critical framework you need to understand what's really going on beneath the headlines. Today, we are wading into what is arguably the most defining friction point in current international relations: the treatment of the Uyghur population in China's Xinjiang region.
And this is a topic that has, it's fundamentally accelerated the confrontation between the West and China. The specific source we are tackling today stems from March 8th, 2021.
Sure.
On that date, the Newlines Institute for Strategy and Policy, in collaboration with the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights, released a document that reverberated globally, the Uyghur Genocide, an examination of China's breaches of the 1948 Genocide Convention.
And it wasn't just another report, was it? It was immediately amplified across Western mainstream media, granted massive authority, and critically heralded as the definitive, unbiased, independent legal analysis of the situation.
That claim of independence and expertise is precisely where our deep dive begins. The Newlines Wallenberg report explicitly positioned itself as the first independent expert application of the 1948 Genocide Convention to ongoing events.
Right.
That statement, that claim of independence, is the foundation upon which its entire political weight rests.
And our source material today takes a methodical, almost forensic approach to questioning that very foundation. We are diving into a detailed critical analysis put out by the Transnational Foundation for Peace and Future Research, or TFF.
Right.
They essentially perform an autopsy on the Newlines Wallenberg report.
And it is absolutely vital that we frame the TFF's position impartially here. Their analysis states up front that it is not making a determination on whether or not genocide is occurring in Xinjiang.
That's a key distinction.
A huge one. They acknowledge they lack the access to make such a judgment. Their sole mandate in this document is to investigate the internal architecture, the independence, methodology, sources, and systematic bias of this one specific, highly publicized report, which was then used to justify major political action.
So we are scrutinizing the scrutinizers. Our mission is to unpack the TFF's critical findings, which focus on whether the Newlines report was truly an independent, fact-based document or something else.
Or whether it served as a piece of ideological and political advocacy. We're looking at what the TFF believes this reveals about the flow of information when these high-stakes, geopolitically charged accusations are involved.
Okay, let's unpack this right away. The TFF analysis flags the claim of independence as the first major point of contention. They argue the report was not an independent academic effort. If not independent, what did the TFF find about the composition, the interest groups and individuals behind the Newlines report?
Well, the TFF analysis concluded that, far from being an objective academic exercise, the report was a coordinated product. It stemmed from a collaboration between individuals and institutions belonging to at least 6 distinct and sometimes overlapping interest groups.
6 groups.
6. And the TFF argues this coalition of interests makes the final product closer to state-affiliated policy advocacy than genuine non-governmental research.
6 interest groups working together. That implies a very strategic, ideologically aligned effort to reach a predetermined conclusion. Walk us through that mixture. What are the 6 intersecting interest groups that TFF identify?
It's a fascinating and, you could say, unusual ideological landscape. First, there's a strong component of Christian fundamentalism. Second, we see deep ties to hawkish conservative U.S. foreign policy circles. Third, there are connections to Muslim Brotherhood circles, specifically relating to the Institute's founders. Fourth, extreme anti-communism forms a central pillar. Fifth, pro-Israeli lobby circles are noted through key figures. And finally, the 6th group is defined as the politicizing machinery of human rights.
What does that mean exactly, politicizing machinery?
The TFF sees this human rights advocacy as being systematically employed to serve or advance specific U.S. interventionist policies, rather than being a neutral application of principles.
That cocktail of groups is astonishingly unique. How often do you see Christian fundamentalism, anti-communism, pro-Israeli lobby interests, and links to the Muslim Brotherhood all coexisting in one document meant to criticize China?
It's a massive political convergence.
It really is. So let's start with the organizational structure itself, the Newlines Institute. What is its origin and structure?
The Newlines Institute was established relatively recently, in 2019, by Dr. Hamid Alwani, who is primarily known as a businessman operating in Northern Virginia. What's crucial is that the TFF analysis reveals Newlines isn't an independent think tank in the typical sense. It's actually a subsidiary of the Fairfax University of America, or FXUA.
FXUA. Now, is that a major established academic research body?
Not at all. And the TFF highlighted this. The Fairfax University of America is small, a private, business-oriented higher education institution with a reportedly minimal student body, around 150 students.
150.
Right. And the TFF noted that FXUA has previously faced scrutiny and issues regarding its educational quality standards. This is important because it really undercuts the image of Newlines as being backed by some major, prestigious academic powerhouse.
It definitely does.
Yeah.
And what about the Institute's founder, Dr. Alwani, and the tie to one of those 6 ideological groups you mentioned, the Muslim Brotherhood circles?
The TFF connects Dr. Alwani to the circle through his family and professional roles. His father, Taha Jabir al-Alwani, was a co-founder of the American Muslim Brotherhood.
I see.
And Dr. Alwani himself currently serves as vice president of the International Institute of Islamic Thought, or I, an organization that the TFF explicitly identifies as affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood.
So the TFF suggests this connection helps explain the focus on the persecution of a major Muslim ethnic minority, but within this very strange coalition of otherwise opposing ideological forces.
Exactly. The coalition is united not by a shared ideology, but perhaps by a shared geopolitical adversary, China.
And Newlines claims independence from foreign government funding, but the TFF argues they had already compromised their neutral position. How so?
The TFF points out that the Institute had already prejudged the issue before commissioning the report. In 2020, Newlines established a task force with the explicit, pre-written mission to determine how the U.S. and its allies could best handle Beijing's efforts to obliterate Uyghur identity and culture.
So the premise was already baked in. They weren't asking if it was happening, they were asking what to do about it.
Precisely. By setting the goal as handling China's obliteration efforts, the Newlines Institute had already accepted the premise of genocide and was simply asking for policy recommendations. The research was therefore commissioned to support a predetermined foreign policy position.
Which, I mean, that severely compromises any claim of an independent fact-finding mission.
Completely.
That makes the claim of neutrality ring hollow. Let's look now at the co-publisher, the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights. What are their ideological ties?
The center was founded by Irwin Cotler, a high-profile international human rights lawyer and a former Canadian justice minister. The TFF analysis focused intensely on the center's selection criteria for its human rights campaigns.
And what did they find?
The center focuses almost exclusively on countries targeted by U.S. foreign policy, specifically naming Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, Saudi Arabia, and Venezuela.
And the critical omission, according to the TFF, what are they not focusing on?
There are virtually no visible major campaigns targeting human rights abuses committed by Western allies or friendly nations. It's a very selective focus. And Cotler himself is described as a very strong advocate for interventionist policy, particularly the responsibility to protect doctrine.
R2P. Can you just briefly elaborate on R2P and why it's so significant here?
Certainly. R2P is a political commitment, arguing that sovereignty comes with the responsibility to protect one's own populations from mass atrocities. If a state fails, the international community has the responsibility to intervene.
Militarily, if necessary.
Yes. And Cotler has consistently advocated for military intervention based on R2P. He criticized Canada for not intervening in Syria. He argued for action in Libya. The TFF notes he even nominated the controversial White Helmets, an organization operating in the Syrian civil war, for the Nobel Peace Prize.
Wow.
Furthermore, he's noted as a strong defender of Israel, often attacking professional colleagues who focus on the Palestinian situation.
So the Wallenberg Center connects to the hawkish foreign policy, the interventionist R2P stance, and the pro-Israeli lobby circles that the TFF identified. All these threads are starting to converge, which makes the report's timing extremely relevant.
The timing is, as the TFF details, the final piece of the political puzzle. The report was published on March 8, 2021. This was less than 2 months after then-Secretary of State Mike Pompeo made his formal determination on January 19, 2021.
The determination that events in Xinjiang constituted an ongoing genocide.
Exactly. And Pompeo made this determination just before leaving office, and the TFF points out it was made without any accompanying public evidence. It was essentially an executive decision.
A political statement?
A very powerful political statement. And this is where the link to the hawkish U.S. foreign policy circles becomes undeniable. Pompeo is a known conservative Christian and an extreme critic of China. To frame the political context, the TFF analysis draws attention to a specific, highly revealing quote from Pompeo in 2019.
That quote about the CIA, correct?
Yes. He expressed pride regarding his time as CIA director, saying, "We lied, we cheated, we stole, we had entire training courses, and it reminds you of the glorious American experiment."
Wow. He actually said that.
He did. And the TFF uses this quote not to attack Pompeo personally, but to underscore that the genocide determination was born out of a self-admitted, strategic political mindset where deception is an acceptable tool of the state.
Rather than a neutral legal assessment of facts.
Precisely. In other words, the TFF concludes that the Newlines report was perfectly calibrated, released just weeks later, to provide the necessary independent legal cover for a determination that had already been made by a highly ideological outgoing administration.
So it reinforced a predetermined political narrative. It served to transition the Pompeo determination from a simple executive declaration into an established fact supported by so-called academic analysis.
That's the argument, advancing a confrontational stance toward China and solidifying the political alignment we just discussed.
Okay, moving on from the institutional architecture, let's get into the actual meat of the documentation. The TSF analysis argues the report relies on a systematically biased selection of sources and experts. If the report has 317 footnotes, which gives it this air of academic rigor, where did the TFF find the systematic bias?
Well, while the Newlines report does include a sprinkling of UN documents and academic journals to, give it legitimacy, the TFF analysis focused on the heavy, systematic reliance on sources that align with that specific U.S. foreign policy objective.
What were some of the highly cited, yet problematic, organizations they flagged?
You see repeated citations of major Western media outlets like the New York Times, The Guardian, and BBC News, which tend to reproduce the mainstream Western narrative. But more critically, the TFF highlights major think tanks that have clear government ties.
Haiku.
The Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, the Hudson Institute, and most notably, the CIA-initiated Jamestown Foundation. The TFF finds that these organizations, without exception, lean in the same specific political ideological direction, all funneling information that supports a single conclusion.
Did the TFF flag any sources just completely non-credible from a basic methodological standpoint?
Yes, and this is a significant flaw for a report claiming academic authority. The TFF flags the Xinjiang victim space, or shahid.biz.
Okay.
This anonymous website is repeatedly cited for victim statements. For instance, detailing specific acts of torture suffered by victim, #124.
Wait, victim number 124, and it's an anonymous website.
Utterly anonymous. It provides zero methodology regarding its source collection, chain of custody, or verification process.
For our listeners who aren't deep in academic research, why does anonymity automatically render a source like that non-credible in this context?
In high-stakes legal or academic documentation, you have to be able to verify the source, the method of collection, the chain of custody. It protects against fabrication or manipulation. If you cite victim #124 from an anonymous website, you have absolutely no way to verify if that victim exists, if the testimony was freely given, or if it was edited.
It's just taking it on faith.
It's pure faith. The TFF points out that using an entirely anonymous, unverifiable website for foundational emotional evidence on torture and abuse is a fundamental breakdown of academic rigor and should have led to its immediate exclusion.
Another source cited frequently is Radio Free Asia, or RFA. What is the TFF's specific critique there?
RFA is cited 22 times in the Newlines report. Now, while RFA presents itself as a private, nonprofit multimedia news corporation, the TFF identifies it unequivocally as an American government medium.
So it's state media.
It operates with a significant budget, around $43 million annually, under the control of the U.S. Agency for Global Media. And crucially, the TFF notes RFA traces its origins back to CIA covert operations initiated in 1948, designed to spread American narratives and counter opposition in specific regions.
So the TFF sees the systematic reliance on sources like RFA and the Jamestown Foundation, both with origins tied to U.S. intelligence or government foreign policy, as reinforcing the conclusion the report is a proxy for state-level interests, not independent research.
Precisely. If your primary sources are government-funded or intelligence-affiliated, the resulting conclusions cannot logically be described as independent.
Now let's turn to the central figure, the one source who is really the foundation of the report's documentation, Dr. Adrian Zenz, cited 41 times.
41 times. It's an overwhelming reliance. The TFF analysis observes that Zenz is cited far more often than any other expert or organization. And the first question the TFF raises is methodological. Why rely so heavily on one expert? Why not attempt to synthesize a diversity of analyses?
And the answer, the TFF suggests, lies in his specific ideological alignment.
Exactly. Let's detail that alignment. Since 2019, Zenz has been a senior fellow in China studies at the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, or VOC, in Washington, D.C.
And the VOC is not a neutral academic body.
Not in the slightest. It's highly political. It was established by a unanimous resolution of the U.S. Congress, and former President George W. Bush served as its honorary chairman for many years.
So what's the TFF's concern regarding the VOC's mission? What do they do?
The VOC is openly committed to extreme anti-communism, and the TFF highlights specific radical claims made by the organization. In 2019, the VOC stated its goal is to surpass the scale of the Nazi Holocaust in public consciousness, making the claim that communism killed over 100 million.
That is an extraordinary statement.
It gets more extreme. The TFF analysis noted that in April 2020, the VOC publicly announced it would add global COVID-19 deaths to this communist death toll, explicitly blaming the Chinese government for every single fatality.
For every death, globally.
Every single one. The TFF argues this context reveals the VOC's position. It's an organization dedicated to the systematic demonization and historical quantification of communism's destructiveness. And that gives Zenz research a clearly defined ideological mandate from the start.
And Zenz himself adds a distinct, openly acknowledged religious dimension to that mandate.
That's the third layer of bias identified by the TFF. Zenz is a self-identified, reborn Christian. And the TFF notes that in a Washington Watch interview, Zenz stated that he feels God has told him to pursue this research on Chinese Muslims and minorities.
He's on a divine mission.
That's how he frames it. And this notion of a divine personal mission is further contextualized by his co-authorship of a 2012 book focusing on rapture theology titled Worthy to Escape: Why All Believers Will Not Be Raptured Before the Tribulation.
So, to summarize the TFF's point, the primary data source for a major international genocide claim stems from an expert who says he's motivated by a divine mandate, affiliated with an organization whose stated goal is extreme anti-communism and historical demonization.
Right, and this leads directly to critiques of his methodology.
What are the specific methodological critiques that TFF references?
The TFF references external criticisms from investigative journalists at places like the Gray Zone and other academic researchers, arguing that Zenz's research often involves what they call statistical malfeasance.
Statistical malfeasance, what does that mean?
It refers to manipulation or misinterpretation of official Chinese government documents to draw conclusions that the data itself does not explicitly support, particularly concerning birth rate statistics and detention figures.
And what about Zenz's choice of publishing outlets? How does that reflect bias?
The TFF notes that Zenz has chosen politically extreme outlets for his research, specifically highlighting the Journal of Political Risk. The TFF looked into the background of this journal and noted its publisher has extensive experience working for multiple U.S. defense and intelligence agencies, including the DIA, NATO, and USPECOM.
So the critique is that instead of seeking publication in traditional peer-reviewed academic journals, Zenz has systematically chosen outlets highly embedded within the U.S. defense and intelligence community.
Exactly. The TFF suggests this systematic choice reinforces the ideological function of his research. It aligns the academic output directly with the foreign policy and military interests of the U.S.
So the TFF is arguing that Zenz was selected as the main witness precisely because of his alignment, not despite it.
That is their conclusion. The consistency of this political alignment across institutions, experts, and source selection is just too strong to ignore.
Which brings us to the central legal element of the claim. Section 3, the question of intent. The legal crux of a genocide determination under the 1948 Genocide Convention is proving intent, the deliberate intention to destroy the targeted group in whole or in part. If everything rests on proving this high-level intent, where does the Newlines report claim to find its smoking gun?
This is the moment of highest scrutiny in the TFF's analysis, and they find the evidence surprisingly frail. The Newlines report's documentation of high-level genocidal intent rests almost entirely on one single source.
One source for the entire claim of intent.
A November 2019 New York Times article. The article is titled, "Absolutely No Mercy. Leaked Files Expose How China Organized Mass Detentions of Muslims."
So the entire legal foundation for a genocide claim against a nuclear-armed power rests on a single journalistic piece based on a leak. What specific language from this NYT article did the Newlines report extract to prove intent?
The TFF identifies 4 key expressions attributed to CCP leadership, including President Xi Jinping, that are used as explicit proof of genocidal intent. And they are stark phrases: eliminate them entirely, break their roots, break their connections, you must kill them all, and comparing the re-education camps to eradicating tumors.
Those quotes are powerful, definitive evidence of intent, if they're verified. But what is the TFF's critical assessment of relying on this single source?
The TFF finds this singular reliance fundamentally problematic because the source material is an unverified leak. The NYT article stated that the documents, some 403 pages of internal Chinese material, were provided by an anonymous member of the Chinese political establishment.
Anonymous.
Right. An anonymous source who requested anonymity and expressed hope that the revelation would hold leaders like Xi accountable.
The chain of custody is non-existent.
Exactly. The TFF stresses there is a complete lack of clarity on the chain of custody, the source's identity, or the process the NYT used to verify all 403 pages of documents. Was the insider acting alone? Did they provide the full, unedited context?
Right.
When the ultimate, most severe legal accusation, genocide, is built on a single, massive, unverified political leak, the empirical basis, as the TFF argues, becomes startlingly weak. It moves from evidence-based analysis to reliance on material that perfectly serves a political narrative.
We have to contrast this with the context provided by the Chinese government, which frames its actions as part of a people's war on terror in Xinjiang, launched in 2014. Does the Chinese government claim to target the Uyghur ethnic group as a whole, or specific extremists?
China frames its policy as targeting extremism and separatist terrorism. And the TFF analysis observes that the Newlines report systematically downplays or omits the issue of terrorism in Xinjiang entirely in order to support the genocide determination.
How do they do that?
They claimed an almost complete absence of terrorist attacks in the early 2000s, and they did so by relying solely on sources that are already highly critical of Chinese policy.
And why is the omission of the terrorism context so critical for the genocide claim to hold up?
Because genocide requires the intention to destroy the ethnic group as such. If China is credibly targeting violent terrorist elements, even if those measures involve gross human rights abuses, it complicates the legal definition of genocide. It could be reclassified as crimes against humanity or massive suppression, but not necessarily genocide.
And it changes the intent part of the equation.
Fundamentally. The TFF points out the irony that even the NYT leak, which provided the quotes on destruction, also contained references to Xi Jinping warning that terrorists should be isolated like rats scurrying across the street. This, too, seems to target terrorists specifically, not the entire population.
So by omitting the context of long-standing terrorist activity, the Newlines report creates a necessary, artificial narrative where China is simply persecuting millions of innocent people solely because of their ethnicity. What specific omitted counter-evidence does the TFF analysis highlight regarding terrorism in Xinjiang?
The TFF provides extensive, verifiable evidence demonstrating past and ongoing terrorist activity that the Newlines report chose to ignore. And crucially, this evidence comes directly from the U.S. government itself.
From the U.S. government, what do their reports say?
The TFF cites the U.S. State Department's own 2001 Patterns of Global Terrorism report. This report documented U.S.-China cooperation against terrorism in Xinjiang, specifically naming groups like the East Turkestan Islamic Party, ETIP, and the East Turkestan Liberation Organization, SHAT, as engaging in violent attacks inside the region.
So the U.S. government was clearly aware of and acknowledged these organized terrorist entities back then?
Absolutely. And there were direct international links that confirmed the presence of organized militancy among certain Uyghur groups.
Such as?
The TFF notes the connection that Uyghur militants were found training with al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. This culminated in U.S. forces capturing 22 Uyghur militants linked to al-Qaeda and subsequently imprisoning them at Guantanamo Bay.
Wow. That is a crucial historical data point. Yeah. The U.S. government itself treated these specific Uyghur individuals not as peaceful citizens, but as enemy combatants linked to international terrorism.
It dramatically complicates the narrative of a completely peaceful population targeted solely for their ethnicity. And what's more, the TFF highlights that in 2018, the U.S. military, via the Pentagon, reportedly bombed training centers for the East Turkestan Islamic Movement, ETIM, in Afghanistan. ETIM had been formally designated a terrorist organization by the U.S. Treasury back in 2002.
So the United States itself was actively engaged in military action against Uyghur-linked terrorist organizations outside of China's borders.
Right. And these actions and designations severely undercut the Newlines report's claim that there is an almost complete absence of terrorist attacks.
So if the Newlines report had included all this context, the State Department reports, the Guantanamo detainees, the U.S. bombing of Etim, how would that affect their overall conclusion?
The TFF concludes that by systematically excluding this material, the Newlines report avoids dealing with the complex reality. While China's response is undeniably massive and involves severe human rights abuses, the TFF cites Chinese government claims of arresting nearly 13,000 terrorists since 2014. It is essential to distinguish between a campaign targeting terrorism and a genocide targeting an ethnic group as such.
And the systematic omission, according to the TFF, serves to manufacture that simple, powerful, black and white narrative needed for the genocide determination.
Exactly. It creates a report that is structurally designed to support a specific geopolitical outcome, the confrontation of China using the most severe legal terminology available.
Now that we've established the methodological and sourcing critique, let's widen the lens and connect this report to the broader geopolitical implications. The TFF analysis also flags internal disagreement within the U.S. government itself regarding the genocide determination.
This is a critical point about the political override of process. The TFF reports that earlier in 2021, the State Department's own legal advisor concluded that there was insufficient evidence to meet the legal criteria for genocide.
Not enough evidence.
Right. Instead, the legal assessment found that the actions amounted to crimes against humanity, a very serious charge, but legally distinct from genocide.
So the career legal advisors disagreed with the outgoing Secretary of State Pompeo's high-level political determination, and yet the Biden administration chose to retain the genocide designation.
That's right. The political determination superseded the internal legal analysis. Linda Thomas Greenfield, when nominated for UN envoy, acknowledged the procedural uncertainty, stating a review is needed, quote, to ensure that the designation can be retained.
Which sort of implies the decision was political first.
The TFF suggests this indicates the designation was retained primarily for political and strategic continuity, overriding internal legal concerns about evidential sufficiency.
And on the other side, what is China's stance on an international investigation?
The TFF notes that China has officially stated it would welcome a visit by the UN Human Rights Council to Xinjiang. Now, of course, the terms of such a visit would be subject to massive debate and potential restriction, but the TFF points out that this offer complicates the narrative of a fully closed state dedicated only to hiding absolute truth.
Okay, so the TFS argues that the Newlines report, with its alignment of media, academia, and foreign policy interests, is a textbook example of a structural phenomenon they call the MIMAC. What exactly does that acronym MI stand for?
MIMAC stands for the Military Industrial Media Academic Complex. It's an expansion of President Eisenhower's 1961 farewell address warning regarding the dangers of the MIC, the Military Industrial Complex.
Right, where private industry and the military mutually benefit from conflict.
Right.
So how have media and academia become integrated into this mechanism, according to the TFF?
The TFF argues that in the post-Cold War world, war requires not just hardware, but ideological justification. Media institutions are key for amplifying specific conflict narratives and suppressing contradictory evidence.
And academia.
Academic institutions and think tanks, like the Newlines Institute, especially those with clear ties to specific foreign policy circles and defense journals, provide the necessary legal, intellectual, and independent framework to justify policy. The MIMAC is therefore the system where academic output, media amplification, and military interests align to produce ideological content that supports a desired geopolitical strategy.
In this case, confrontation with China. So the Newlines report didn't just happen, it was generated by this complex. And what was the reaction of the media component of the MIMAC?
The TFF reserves some of its strongest criticism for the Western mainstream media, noting the systematically uncritical reception of the Newlines report. They argue that the media granted the report immediate, prominent, and often unquestioning attention.
So they failed to do basic due diligence.
They failed to perform the basic professional duty of checking the institutional background, questioning the claim of independence, or scrutinizing the single-source, unverified evidence regarding intent. This failure allowed the politically motivated narrative to instantly become global fact.
This analysis requires us to step back and ask the comparative question. Is the Newlines report applying a consistent standard for human rights? The TFF brings up a tough comparison to the U.S.-led Global War on Terror, or GWOT.
The TFF stresses that a comparative perspective is essential to avoid ideological double standards. They pose a crucial question. If China's actions in Xinjiang are defined as genocide, a high-stakes term that should be reserved for the most extreme crimes, how do the human costs of China's war on terror compare to the human costs of the U.S.-led global war on terror?
What are the TFS numbers regarding the human cost of the GWOT?
The TFF cites research from Brown University's Cost of War Project, a highly respected source. Their findings indicate that the GWOT has resulted in the displacement of at least 37 million people globally.
37 million.
37 million. The TFF asks a pointed question. If displacing 37 million innocent civilians through U.S. military action on a global scale is not considered a severe violation of human rights that rises to this level of scrutiny, what standard is being applied to China?
The implication being that the Newlines report lacks this essential comparative context. It treats China as an independent variable driven purely by evil, which is a convenient framework for advancing a policy of global dominance and intervention.
That's the TFF's core critique. The report selectively applies human rights discourse solely as a tool to advance a confrontational stance against a specific geopolitical rival, failing to apply the same level of legal or ethical scrutiny to the actions of Western powers or their allies.
And this selective application serves the interests of the MIMAC, rather than the principles of global human rights.
So, to synthesize the exhaustive findings of the TFF analysis, the Newlines Wallenberg report on the Uyghur situation is fundamentally unreliable for its stated purpose. Its empirical basis for the genocide accusation is, and I'm quoting here, surprisingly weak.
Surprisingly weak.
Yes, resting on highly selective, politicized material that deliberately omits contrary perspectives on terrorism and lacks a methodological rigor expected of an independent document.
We've seen that information presented as independent expert application often carries significant political and ideological baggage, especially when it aligns perfectly with the foreign policy interests of a superpower. This deep dive really shows how essential it is to scrutinize not just the shocking conclusions of a report, but the institutions, the experts, and the methodology behind it, particularly when those conclusions are leveraged to justify massive geopolitical friction.
The TFF analysis cautions that the escalating Cold War-like relationship between the West and China will determine the course of the 21st century. And they argue that reports characterized as propaganda and systematic demonization actively invite confrontation, rather than promoting the dialogue, multipolarity, and mutual cooperation that the TFF believes are essential to reduce global tension.
Which brings us to our final provocative thought for you to consider, drawing directly from the historical pattern the TFF highlighted. The TFF analysis noted that major conflict narratives historically used to justify military action, such as the looming genocide of Kosovo Albanians, the claims regarding Saddam's WMD, or the exaggerated threat of Gaddafi's planned mass murder, later proved to be psychopolitical warfare, opinion fraud, or lies.
Yes, a very stark warning.
These narratives successfully served Cold War goals and justified destructive military interventions. So considering this clear historical pattern of politically motivated narratives preceding intervention, how much do we risk escalating a conflict with a nuclear-armed power like China based on documentation that may ultimately serve political goals over verifiable, comprehensive facts?
Indeed. It forces us to ask whether the rhetoric of human rights is being used constructively to build global cooperation and solve complex problems, or whether it is being weaponized merely to shut down dialogue and promote dangerous confrontation.